Thanks a lot. Thanks to Camille and to Pedin for hosting this event. It's very interesting for me. And I'm Luis Santamaria. I come from the Doñana Biological Station. I have a small role in working together with the team of Pedin in deploying some of the automated reporting sensors. And what I want to do today is talk a bit about the overall design of this kind of networks, especially when integrating them with other methodologies. And I will use examples from visual and audio sensors, but since the following presentation is going to focus on the design of audio sensory networks, then I try to avoid a bit these kind of examples and focus a bit more on visual sensors and ultrasound. Now, what I'm going to tell you comes from my experience, our experience in the long-term biodiversity monitoring program of Doñana. See if we can get this. No. And very briefly, this is the longest long-term monitoring program in the Spanish National Park. It's running since 1973, when the bird counts started, and after that, it has been incorporating monitoring aspects in all kinds of different ecosystem components. And since 2013, we have been working in integrating remote sensing and automatization in our program. The program was restructured in 2016 to align it with management goals, and this slide just wants to show a bit of, or give the flavor of all the different things we measure that goes from many different species and habitat and biotic components to processes and to abiotic components. And basically, within these 6 thematic areas, we have 50 different protocols. So we have basically a monitoring team of 13 to 16 people and over 16 stations with automated sensors. So with this dimension, we have basically robot messages. We have a large monitoring team which use a really broad variety of methods that goes from going in a host and doing observations to flying drones, using satellite images, or using, I don't know, heavy towers. And with this variety of methods, we have to be working in trying to be economic and efficient in integrating the methods to ensure that we can maintain this over the long run. This is a table. Well, the problem is it's not fully visible. This is a table of the methods over the different years. This is was our traditional approach. Just as an example, we monitor carnivores using traps, and then lately we have been incorporating camera traps, or we monitor birds using a combination of ringing campaigns and observations, largely not only visual but also singing point singing recordings by observers. And lately we have been trying to start to incorporate audio sensors, or for example, we record different types of all kind of vegetation variables using a combination of observation, drone, and satellite. So this is all the variety of methods we have. And what we were facing was that our traditional approaches, if you take in the plane, XY plane, the space, and the Z dimension depicts time, our traditional approach was taking point observations at different places over time. Now, this provides, if you design it properly, a good monitoring of the different components you want to monitor, but especially in large areas with rough terrain and difficulties to visit often, it has some strong limitations. When we started to be able to incorporate remote sensing provided us with a spatial integration. So every now and then we will get a satellite picture from which we could derive some variables that could be amenable to some of the process we want to measure. And in that moment, our scattered points became a continuous image in space. And it was very important to try to design our observations to coincide as much as possible with the moment when we were getting these images, so we could have ground truth and we could use that to interpolate our observations. When we started to use not only satellite sensors or remote sensing, but automated sensors, they provide us with a continuous temporal integration, which was extremely valuable, especially in remote points. And now the trick or what we are busy with is expand the number of sensors we use. Originally, the sensors were things like depth meters, salinity meters, that will give you really a continuous reading that you could directly translate into a string of numbers. So that was quite comfortable. Then we designed the sampling to be able to not only obtain ground truth, but to have temporal intercalibration over time with this sensor, and even to try to have moments when we have both ground truth and temporal intercalibration together. So that's the design we are at. Now, the sensors we are going to talk about today are not as easy to work with because the data processing is much more complex. So when you have a depth meter or a salinity meter, normally the variable you get measured is a string of numbers you can directly use. And when you have an audio sensor for singing birds or a video camera trap, a video trap or a camera trap, what you have is something you have to interpret, and either you have to develop automated IT methods to get the data, or you have to do it by hand, and then if you do that, they have a strong component of direct observation. So you have to be much more economic with its use, and the design has to be much more careful. Now, what I am going to do is provide a couple of examples to make the point that if you combine methods, you can obtain, and you design carefully your deployment to be able to combine methods, then you can profit much more from your observations. Now, aromatic, acoustic, and visual monitors, well, you can measure a range of variables from the community level to the, well, from the individual to the population to the community level. Those are the most common. They are very often used to do diversity surveys to see which species are in the points where you deploy them, or to look at interactions among species, one species avoiding another, for example. You can obtain population parameters. The most straightforward is abundance. Abundance normally is not very useful because it's very difficult to extrapolate spatially, but if you can derive density estimate, then you can extrapolate those and obtain population counts. And you can derive demographic parameters, like, for example, the male-female ratio, the number of youngs, that together with the density can be used to do population models. And at the individual level, then you can get data on spatial distribution. So for example, or spatio-temporal patterns, you can derive data on activity patterns and the reasons behind them, like again, species interactions, and observations on behavior, like activity, direct choice, interactions. So this is a whole range of things you can do. And the main issue here is, depending on what your main interest is, your design has to be different. So I will just present a couple of examples, first from visual recorders and then from ultrasound recorders. This is a recent work done by people from the biological station, comparing biodiversity surveys with 4 different methods. The main message of this paper is that if you use single methods, you miss species. If you combine methods, you get the best survey and the best survey results in terms of the species detection. And in this case, camera traps were one of the worst methods. Of course, you could argue that perhaps what should be improved was the design of the camera trap network deployed. But the key message here is, even if you want to optimize your design, you need alternative methods to compare with and to validate. So when you are deploying, it's very important to use different sources of evidence, even if you are looking for something as simple as species detection, and at the minimum, use different methods to optimize your design. Of course, these automated sensors provide much more information than just species detection, and that's one of their values. So, for example, they can be quite useful in detecting things like activity patterns. This is derived from camera traps. In the x-axis you have the hours in the day, and then you have a very good determination of activity patterns. Something similar you can obtain with audio sensors. But when you go to interpreting what is behind these activity patterns, then you need to get things like, for example, spatiotemporal interactions. So very often with these sensors, you can detect different species, and then by using statistical models, you can determine whether one species is avoiding one. Now, for example, this may include species avoiding human activity, which is one of the things we want to do in the campus in this project. So if you design properly your sensor network and you register also human activity, then you can determine to what extent human activity is making other wildlife species avoid the place. But because this avoidance can be in space or in time, then you normally need to use an adequate spatial design and use all the data to be able to detect it. Now, this is a paper that was using different statistical methods, analytical methods, to discriminate between spatial and temporal interactions. But one of the main messages, very often people pull different stations, and if you do that, not only you will lose information that you could use, but also you tend to inflate overlap, because if the species are segregated in space and you pull the data, then you will detect them as overlapping. So you have to be careful to deploy adequately in space and to analyze the data separately with adequate models to be able to separate spatial segregation from temporal segregation. Another thing that is quite useful is a component of this spatial segregation is daily ranges. So how much an animal moves per day. And for example, this is an inherent assumption in using many audio recorders. So when you, for example, are either doing bird counts by observers or by recorders in breeding birds, you want to avoid several points registering the same individuals. So you very often space the points to avoid including the territory of the same individual in several of them. Well, with camera traps, there has been recent work by people from IREC working with people from Doñana to develop methods to estimate these daily ranges without having to resort to the expensive method, which was coloring animals with GPS colors. And the main message of this work is that if you combine adequate spatial design with the behavioral observation you can derive from the image, then you can get this estimate. However, again, validating them with a set of GPA scholars or obtaining movement data from GPA scholars can improve this method. And a follow-up from this is that you can use these estimates from activity ranges to derive accurate density estimates. This is a paper where they compare 3 different methods to calculate population density. And the conclusion is that depending on the circumstances, different method works. And the best is that you use complementary observation from other data, GPS data, transect counts, to both inform model selection and inform model construction, and then select the best model. The message from this is some of these methods are expensive, but you can use them once to select your methods, and then after that resort to your automated recorders to continue doing observations over time without having to validate them all the time. So this expensive data like GPS data or transect counts, or in effort or in money, can be like the layers I was showing you of spatial integration. So moments when you have detailed spatial data and then allow you to construct models, and you can continue over time with your sensors. Then you get this temporal integration. So this is a bit the couple of examples I brought from visual sensors, with the main message is that if you combine wisely different methods, then you can resolve complex questions that you cannot approach otherwise just by putting the recorders in the field and getting to analyze data. A last example I wanted to show you is an example using ultrasound sensors, and in this case, this comes from a large project, Adaptamed, where we were having these blue plots. There were 3 groups of 3 plots where we were applying different forest density treatments to see the effects on biodiversity. And now we got a forest fire, this huge forest fire we got in Doñana in 2016, actually. And this is the satellite image that we use to estimate which areas were affected and with severity. Now, 3 of our plots were affected with different levels of severity. And actually, we were deploying our bat sensors in these places. And that provided us with an opportunity to compare the impact of burning on bat activity. And this is an example of the kind of data we got. Our most common species was Pipistrellus cuni. We had relatively high abundance of noctules bat. It's just a very interesting species from the south, the largest bat in Europe, and it's a very interesting bat. And for example, one of the rarest species was the lesser horseshoe bat. Pipistrellus cuni in this first year, 2018, 2019, was above 90% abundance. So actually, we lab data to estimate the activity in areas that were affected or not by the fire. And it was relatively surprising because we know that bats do better in open areas very often when you have forest clearing, that we found a much higher bat activity in areas that have been burned. Now, we continue recording in the following years because we are interested in things like will this hold over time, or when the place regrows, it will start again going back. Also, forest clearings will have the same effect, the kind of thing that we are applying. And also, how much of this is differences in food availability, for example, or habitat to hunt, and how much of this is really increases in local averages. But while we ran this several years to answer this question, the fact is that we deployed a second set of observations. In this case, we deployed nest boxes, and in the nest boxes, we knew the place had very few refuges. In the nest boxes, we could actually measure occupation, which is a measure of abundance. Now, the bars in the left side are the areas that were burned, and the other areas you can see are the areas which are still, let's say, green. And it was, first surprise was this is less than a year after deployment of the boxes, and we have occupation or at least box uses of 80 to 100% very often. That's extremely high, and that reflects the high demand for refuges that you have in these kind of places. It's afforestation, fine afforestations, which have very few refuges. The second thing is we have very high occupation in the area that were burned, which suggests that at least if you have refuges, it's not only that they use them more, but they are more abundant there. So using these areas more often results in higher abundances. And the third thing, which is a bit the interpretation surprise that you cannot do only with the sensors unless you have complementary methods, is that in the other areas we have a very high occupation by an animal that was supposed to be very rare in the area, which is the dormouse. And the dormouse actually, both for birds, nesting birds, and for bats, have also a predatory role. So one of the reasons why the bats are so abundant there could not only be food, but it could also be predation. And it's something then that we want to explore in the near future. Now, the wrap-up message of these examples is simply that you should consider carefully the spatiotemporal complementarities among different monitoring methods because they give different information, and if you don't design it properly, you don't optimize it. And that you should try to tailor your design to the questions addressed, and you have to exercise measure because often with automated sensors, especially those with complex signal processing, more is often not best. You may have information overload that prevents you from optimally using data. And thank you for this. If you have any questions, I hope I'm more or less on time.
Yes, you have plenty of time for questions. Thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting. Yeah, feel free to raise your hand. I can see already one hand raised. If you want to unmute Sugata and ask your question.
Yeah. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So, there was a graph which showed that burnt forest have the greater bat activity, right?
So, bad activity.
That the burnt forest have the better bat activity, right?
Yeah.
But that activity was measured by the sound recorder or by like some other method. So I just missed that.
Yeah. So I mean, this is a very simplified result from the ultrasound recorders, and this because 95% of the abundance was a single species with lamp-tall species, and here we represent the number of detections per hour.
Yeah, but the burnt forest actually have low sound attenuation rate. Is there any chance that may affect that may misjudge the activity of the bat?
You mean we are detecting more because the habitat allows for more detections?
Yeah, the burnt forest don't have like very low attenuation rate as compared to dense forest.
It is possible, and it's a bit difficult to test because overnight it's difficult to complement these observations with other observations. And the data from other sources like the nest boxes suggest that there is actually more activity there. And we are processing now different bat species because they being of very different size and sound patterns, they have different location efficiency for the sensor. So it's interesting that this question is interesting to look at. But my feeling is that the result reflects mostly a much larger activity there. We could try to deploy mist nets or something to test for this also. So that's a good idea. That's a good idea that we try to make sure there is more activity there. I mean, the question is more activity can be more detection, can be more animals being more active, moving more, and it can be also having more animals flying there, even if afterwards they go to sleep somewhere else. So this is the things we have to try to sort out, to separate.
I think the only way you can test that if you place several recorder in the close by, and then you can test like how many active pattern, how like single species detected by multiple recorder, and how many like how far the recorder can detect. Can be calculated from that. There is a package in like acoustic ACCR. So AACR, so it can like help you to like it's like it takes too much effort, but this is the only way I think you can do that. Like if this is resultant of a low attenuation rate or higher attenuation rate, you can do that.
Yeah, that's very good. I mean, actually, with the bird sensors, we try to validate detection distance. What we do, for example, is we go doing observation counts at the same time that we record with the sensor, and then when we do the observation counts of some we measure the distance at which the different birds are singing. So we get detection curves similar to the ones you get in the distant methods from transects from the observer, and we can then compare with the detection curves we get from the sensor. Now, that's something we have never done with the ultrasound because we cannot do distance observation from the observer. But what we could try to do is use a source of sound, or use different recorders to try to build that up. Yeah. So I mean, the answer is we have validated this when we use audio sensors sometimes, but we have never validated this with the ultrasound sensors. And it's clear that the habitat structure has a strong effect on the detection curve.
There are a couple of questions and comments in the chat. So David Williams said, asked whether you could use a high number of detectors in the grid and do spatial analysis of activity.
Yeah, that's why I was showing these examples from camera traps because I think they are partly amenable to audio recorders. The difference with camera traps, I mean, there is advantages, disadvantages. The advantage of audio recorders is that they are omnidirectional, which gives a better detection to analyze. Camera traps provide you additional information, for example, on the direction of movement of the animal, things that you can use to then estimate, obtain density estimates or behavioral estimates. So with the audio recorders, you don't have that information, and that information is quite often used for both density estimate and daily range estimate. But if you combine it with an additional method that provides you movement estimates or range estimates, and then you validate your methods for your network of audio stations, then you could continue using them and then obtain this estimate. So I think in the future it will be a very good area of work to use methods that have been applied with camera traps to obtain spatial and density estimates with audio sensors.
And then Eva is making a comment saying that there is not so much vegetation attenuation with ultrasound. So he thinks it's unlikely to explain such a strong pattern in that passage. So I think we might move on to the next presenter. There is one more question in the chat that we can maybe answer